Mormons, also known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, probably have their own special operations team. Not only that, but the LDS Church as an organization is one of the most prepared groups out there for an apocalyptic scenario. My name is Samson, and welcome to my first actual video. The Mormon Church has a very large, very secretive security apparatus. Within this organization, I believe there are possibly more teams full of personnel that are much more competent, much more trained than their peers. Saying that they have a special ops team might be a bit of a stretch, but I do believe that they recruit from special forces for reasons that I'll get into later. But in order to understand why they would do this, we need to understand their beliefs. We need to understand why they do the things that they do. Mormonism is a branch off of Protestant Christian beliefs. The whole thing started around 1820 when 14-year-old Joseph Smith claimed to have been receiving visions from God. And this is also during a Christian historical period known as the Second Great Awakening, where Christians were already just going nuts. There is a very interesting narrative behind Joseph Smith, but long story short, he got really popular, got a very massive following, allegedly found some golden plates buried by the Native Americans long ago and transcribed them into the modern-day Book of Mormon. This book and the belief itself took off because it kind of answered the question at the time, how did Native Americans come to be? Why are they here? Obviously, Christians lost their shit, and after a series of very deadly skirmishes, the bulk and the head of the group moved to Salt Lake City in Utah, where the Mormons continue to this day. But that was not before our boy Joseph Smith cucked his best friends by sleeping with their wives and got himself shot to death by a summary firing squad. Today, the church has over 17 million members, with 7 million Americans calling themselves Mormon. They have an absolutely massive influence in Utah, as well as in surrounding states like Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, and more. Worldwide, they have a pretty big influence, mostly in the Pacific Islands like Polynesia, Micronesia, as well as South America. As I said earlier, the Mormons have their own security forces, which are sometimes jokingly called the Mormon Secret Service or the Mormon Army. I hate to admit it, but a lot of specific details about the Mormon security forces are very hard to come by. I don't know even basic things like how large they are or their organizational layout. I mean, we have an idea in the few hundreds, but any statements from them are probably not going to be accurate because a lot of this is by design. What I do know is they primarily draw from law enforcement officers. In fact, a lot of the security forces personnel in Utah serve concurrently as deputies or whatever. As far as their role, they're used primarily for bodyguards, for LDS leadership. It's kind of corporate the way that their security wing is made. But they do have a lot of ground security for just monitoring temples or sites of importance. What's interesting about these guys is that they do hire based on belief. You have to be worthy of entering a temple to even be eligible for the position. It's worth noting that anytime you prioritize other values during job seeking, typically that's at the expense of merit. For example, a Navy SEAL would probably be a better security officer than your average cop. But if the Navy SEAL doesn't have temple worthiness, which isn't Mormon, that's going to disqualify him. They're not even going to look at his application. This may seem insignificant, but I think it demonstrates a strong desire for in-group association, which kind of helps in maintaining this secrecy. Mormon OPSEC. But I'm not saying that they're incompetent. In fact, all my sources say otherwise. A lot of the applications are asking for law enforcement experience or military experience, first aid training preferred. You do kind of have to ask, what's the point of the secrecy though? Why are they so concerned with protecting temples and LDS leadership? Why would they prioritize in-group loyalty as opposed to the most merit-based hiring program? To grasp this, we're going to go back to Mormonism as a whole and examine their beliefs. The latter, in Latter-day Saints, means literally that we are living in the latter days leading up to Revelations. If you know anything about Revelations, it's basically the end of the world, and it foretells Christ's second coming. But if Christ is coming to earth, why not prepare for that? Well, they are, but before we see Christ again, we're supposed to endure something called tribulations, which can be best summarized as literal hell on earth. Supposedly this lasts 7 years, but depending on who you're reading, it could be shorter or longer. Point is, it's going to devastate humanity, and most modern governments are not going to be capable of keeping up. It's for this reason that people make fun of Mormons as being preppers, or being like the largest prepper organization in the world, and this is why they have such a big investment into preparing. In fact, Mormon families are often encouraged to stockpile months worth of food, of rations, emergency funds, weapons, first aid. They have things called 72-hour kits. They're very popular. At a young age, they're encouraged to learn how to grow and can food and distinguish between useful and dangerous wildlife. Being completely honest, many of the Mormons that I have talked to have been insanely knowledgeable about living off the grid if something were to actually happen. Now, all of this is common knowledge. It's something they're very open about, and I'm not really saying anything crazy or unknown here. What isn't common knowledge is a concept known as baptism after death, something the LDS invests heavily in. In fact, the LDS Church is the only large-scale organization to actively believe that if somebody dies, you can baptize them. Now, you have to have their name. You have to have the name of some of their ancestors. It's not very clear, but I'm pretty sure like mother, father, or someone related to them. And what's interesting is they still get agency to choose. So even after you die, supposedly, you get the choice to accept the baptism or not. So it's not just like an automatic Mormon conversion. So how does this all tie in with the bigger picture? To understand that, we need to discuss my biggest point for this video, which is Mormon infrastructure. Over the LDS Church's history, they have made a series of very large investments reflecting the beliefs that we just discussed. One thing I should start off clarifying is the difference between a Mormon temple and a Mormon chapel. A chapel, sometimes called a meeting house, is the Mormon equivalent to a church. Why they don't call it a church, I don't really know. But either way, chapels are open to the public. They're often pretty, but they're still practical. They kind of have this smaller town, small church feel. Temples, on the other hand, are a bit more elitist. In fact, Mormons tend to believe that temples are some of the most holiest places on earth. And for that reason, you have to be approved by LDS leadership to enter in the first place, to get what's called temple worthiness. And it's like a little card or certification that you get that says, hey, this person can enter a Mormon temple. To be approved, you have to have been baptized, you have to have paid your tithes, and you have to have lived very strictly in accordance to Mormon beliefs. I should have mentioned this earlier, but tithes are 10% of your annual income. It's like an annual subscription service for getting to have multiple wives. They aren't mandatory for being Mormon, but they are mandatory for entering the temple and ascending to any leadership positions. In fact, it's the primary source of revenue for the LDS Church as a whole. Back to infrastructure, I've talked to plenty of Mormons and ex-Mormons, and enough of them will mention secret rooms in chapels and even some temples. Sometimes it's an obscured doorway, sometimes it's like a false wall. Now, it's not extremely common, and the Mormons I've talked to have made it a point not to blow it out of proportion, considering the contents of these secret rooms are usually empty, or sometimes they'll contain pools for baptism. But it does continue to stress that question, why? Why the secrecy? Why invest so much into a hidden room? But what if I told you there was more than a hidden room? The LDS Church headquarters is a massive complex of multiple buildings in Salt Lake City, Utah. Did you know that their buildings have running tunnels under them, connecting them all? Not even a conspiracy, it's just commonly known. It's about as common as like a subway system. The actual conspiracy part are sightings of tunnels nationwide. I have found countless threads discussing tunnels, bunkers, or weird doorways leading into underground places in LDS Church temples. Even though it's not confirmed, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. Now, I'm not saying they have state-of-the-art fallout vaults, but they have tunnels and secret obscured rooms. If that's what we know about, then what do we not know about? And again, why? Why the secrecy? And speaking of fallout vaults, let's discuss Granite Mountain Records Vault. This vault is a 30-minute drive southeast of the LDS headquarters in Salt Lake City. What this vault contains is millions of genealogical records on a format known as microfilm. The vault is inside of this mountain, wedged in a valley containing reinforced doors with an internal water reservoir. Some people are speculating, and I would personally wager that they are digitizing the microfilms right now since they don't last very long. But if you're like me, you're probably thinking, well, Why not, why family records? Why not rations, or maybe preserving weapons or safe houses for leadership? Now, I have two answers to this. Remember earlier when I discussed baptism for the dead? This is where that happens. Built in the 60s among Cold War concerns, this vault is made to withstand nuclear detonations. Understandably, a lot of Christians believe that the conduit through which Revelations unfolds is going to be nuclear warfare. The vault's sole purpose, to my understanding, is to baptize the millions, if not billions, of people that would die in a last-ditch effort to save as much of humanity as you could in an apocalyptic scenario. As of right now, chapels and temples are responsible for performing the rites of baptism after death. But if the temples or chapels are destroyed or preoccupied, the Mormons will be prepared. But I said that I have two answers. My other answer is that I do not believe for 1 second that they don't have rations or quarters or armories or whatever. In any apocalyptic scenario where the world is destroyed or close to it, baptizing the dead is going to take an innumerable amount of time and resources. And for the personnel who are going to be conducting this, you're going to need support staff managing food, maintaining the vault, maybe even conducting security. Jumping back into security, let's discuss my favorite piece of infrastructure yet, the Global Security Operations Center, also known as the LDS, GSOC. The LDS doesn't disclose anything about the GSOC themselves, but the contractors who built it do, so we're going to listen to them. According to them, the GSOC is the LDS's state-of-the-art head of their entire security apparatus. The GSOC is responsible for the live monitoring of hundreds of LDS facilities. It acts as a kind of dispatching center for Mormon security forces, and basically it's their command and control center. But who are they dispatching? They admit that it has a security dispatch center that receives live audio and video feeds from what I can't really figure out, but I'd assume temples and even some of the more popular chapels. They also say there's a crisis room and a secondary crisis room in the structure. They have a training room. They have server rooms and electronic support rooms. So this is a very large, very modern facility. I mean, you have to realize that this level of security is insane. It rivals most corporations and even some government facilities. My guess is that the ideal way for the GSOC to be used is as a QRF and civilian resource dispatcher. QRF is something known to the military and law enforcement as Quick Reaction Force. Basically, if something goes wrong, or the force you have in an area isn't enough, or you just need a problem solved, you mobilize the QRF to go violently solve whatever problem needs to be fixed. QRF, by their nature, is supposed to be on standby, so why else would they have a security dispatch room? Now, understandably, there are limits to this theory. A QRF based in Utah isn't going to be much help to a problem in Missouri. That's why the Q in QRF stands for quick. What it does mean is that they can allocate resources to where they're needed most. Sometimes they don't have to rely on church security. If there's a problem, local police or fire or EMS can probably figure it out, or even outsource private security if they need to. And if I had to guess, in most scenarios, they probably do just that. They use their live feeds to notify local emergency services or whoever and have them solve the problem. Sometimes the most effective thing you can do is just have someone whose job it is to alert higher echelons of problem solvers, i.e. cops, fire, EMS. There is one last piece of infrastructure that I want to bring to the table here, and it seems insignificant to the other buildings, but to me is a sort of Freudian slip. According to this article, in 2019, the LDS church leaders planned to build a firearms training center in Salt Lake City. I have found no sources confirming that this building's construction, or if the project at all was finalized or moved or updated. For all I know, it could be. They're just not trying to advertise it. They already own the warehouse and several acres of surrounding land, so it's not like they have to worry about buying it. It's more about converting it to an existing training center. What I can for sure gather is their intent, which this article does a very good job at explaining. It goes on describing firing lanes and classrooms, which all sound typical for an organization wanting to expand its security presence. What isn't typical is, in just one sentence, the author says that 10 rooms are reserved for force-on-force training, and then he goes on about the rest of whatever the article's about. But force-on-force means people versus people, with instructors or competent individuals or someone mediating the situation to decide what happens next. Like, okay, you killed this guy, keep clearing the room, keep pushing, whatever. Force-on-force training was some of the best training that I've ever gotten to do in the Marines. I'm not trying to blow it out of proportion. If you play Airsoft, that's basically what force-on-force is, but what missions are you going to have where you are in direct combat with other people? Even if you say they're just spending money on what sounds nice or what is recommended to them, clearly whoever is making the church's security decisions is competent enough to be aware of modern training doctrine and practices, and so that's just something you don't see a lot with corporate security. Salt Lake City is the Mormon capital of the world. It has their leadership, it has their infrastructure, it has everything necessary for connecting every other Mormon to the LDS chain of command. If something happens to Salt Lake City and renders church infrastructure obsolete, the chances of Mormons being able to live through tribulations and baptize the rest of the population decrease dramatically. This is why they built the vault. On top of the vault, the GSOC can be used as an early warning system for Mormons globally, giving them time to prepare for whatever horrific disaster is coming. But like any organization, they need leadership. This is where the Mormon president and his apostles come in. These guys are the top players in the LDS chain of command, with the president himself being considered a form of prophet. Now, of course, when you think the world is out to get you, you are going to invest heavily in security for yourself. So you get yourself bodyguards, a form of static security. But what if that's not enough? What if the world really does end? What if you need help with a problem or with a situation that is more than what your bodyguards can handle? Well, that introduces the concept of a more dynamic, reactive security. Essentially a more reactive mobile force. This goes back to our QRF of earlier. I mean, after all, they admitted to having a security dispatch center, so again, who are they dispatching? If cops and security consultants understand the value of having a specialized, competent, dynamic reaction force, such as like a SWAT team or something, surely they'd want to maintain a team of competent individuals on standby for if something were to happen. For this team, you want the most competent individuals ever. Luckily, when I was looking online, I found this LDS church-sponsored website called ldssof.com. which fronts itself as like a veteran get-together group specifically for Mormon special operators. Now, it might seem weird, but that's like, okay, I'm familiar with these groups. I've seen a lot of them. I've seen the way that they advertise, and they just literally get together and go do fun shit. And like every other veteran group out there, they probably have a massive public presence to recruit more veterans. After all, there's no reason to be secretive, but they don't. There is not one instance of a Mormon SOF or a Mormon veteran group get-together. And when you go on this website's application, they are requesting relatively sensitive military information. Nothing crazy, but it's information that other groups just would not care about, like your rank and even proof of like certificate of program graduation. Now, you could argue, sure, maybe this is so they can verify their members, but how many special operators out there are genuinely Mormon? Could it be that this website is a recruitment front? And if the Mormons can get their hands on a special operator, do you really think they'd waste his talents on being a bodyguard? Even considering that super tiny police departments have their own SWAT teams, why wouldn't a multi-billion-dollar organization with serious security concerns do the same, especially when their religion demands it? Not to mention all the recent attacks on Mormon churches, there is no better time to prepare for tomorrow than today. And that is what Mormons love doing, is preparing. No offense to any Mormons out there, but the LDS Church is an extremely paranoid organization, and it makes sense because, like I said, your beliefs kind of demand this paranoia if you think the world is genuinely about to end. Regardless, there are two main points to this video, two things that we can for sure establish. One, the LDS Church is one of the most prepared organizations on earth for an apocalyptic scenario. Maybe not as prepared as the United States government or some other governments, but for a civilian organization, they're doing pretty good. Two, the great lengths at which they establish their security and support personnel suggest the existence of a higher caliber, more competent reaction force than just your average Mormon security officer. Now, as much as I love the idea of a Mormon David Goggins, the reality could just be it's a group of ex-cops who are just much more highly trained and capable than their peers. And if this group did really exist, it would not be big at all. I'd be surprised if it was more than like 10 or 20 people. But now you see my point. I may be wrong, but if I had to gamble on it, if I had to guess, I would say absolutely that they have some sort of Mormon SWAT, some Mormon Special Response Team, Mormon SOCOM. It, in some shape or form, exists. And you cannot convince me otherwise. Either way, thank you for watching, and do remember, I'm in your walls.